Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on gender and education, today we are going to talk on education under globalization. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. Dr. Shruti Webb is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV, Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Webb has immense experience and she believes in giving her best to the students. Therefore, through the live platform, she gives her utmost knowledge to you. Friends, let's welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Webb, and let's try to understand today's topic in detail, that is education under globalization. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Hello, Geetika. It's my pleasure to be on this platform and share the knowledge. So friends, in the last lecture, we were discussing about globalization, the very genesis of globalization, and how it has come to impact various sectors of Indian economy since 1990s. So today our focus would be specifically on education, and not only school level education but also higher education, as to how these various levels of education are gradually getting impacted and what is the gender specific impact of such trends. So beginning our discussion, let us discuss with the issue as to what happens to education under globalization. So as we had discussed, globalization is largely a technologically driven and knowledge driven society. Hence, the very success of any kind of economic reform policies critically depends upon the competence of the human capital. So, therefore, as part of the macroeconomic adjustment and education are closely related through the budgetary mechanism. So the whole issue of education and funding of education takes center stage. So because it is technologically driven and it is a process which is never ending once it takes off. So therefore the governments, all those countries which are going through the phase of globalization, have to ensure that their population is not merely population, rather it is transformed into human capital by developing various kind of competencies among them. So therefore, budget restructuring becomes a major issue, and budget restructuring is also a strategy of economic adjustment which leads to reduction in public spending on education and declining budgets for education, which in turn has another negative impact, and that is effect on the quantity and quality of education. And this is precisely what has been happening in India. As part of the structural adjustment processes, which we had discussed in the last lecture, the reason behind these structural adjustment processes was the clear directive that had been given by the IMF and the World Bank in 1990s, that in order to reduce the fiscal deficit, Indian government was bound to decrease its expenditure on various social sectors, on various heads, and education and health both fell sadly in that category. So therefore, once the process of reduction in public expenditure on these sectors begins, then the impact on both the quality as well as quantity is felt, and particularly this can be spoken with regard to education. Then a fiscal squeeze is experienced in almost all social sector investments in India, including specifically in education, as part of the structural adjustment practices or SAPs. These policies are found to have caused significant reduction in rates of growth of budget expenditure on education. As the state support for education declines, the supply of skilled manpower also might fall, producing shortages of skilled manpower, which again has a detrimental effect on the overall growth and functioning of not only economy but in fact the entire nation as a whole. then the deterioration in the education output also has a negative impact on both macroeconomic growth as well as microeconomic tendencies, which are bound to get impacted not only from a short-term perspective but also long-term perspective, thereby again affecting the overall economic growth. Then there are some specific fears that are associated with education. So if we are not talking from a general kind of a perspective and we are specifically discussing the impact on education, then there are some points that one must discuss, like during the phases of globalization, soft sectors like education get specifically neglected, and during the phases of globalization also quantitative expansion may take place but quality gets traded off. That is, there is definitely mellowing down in the quality. So while quantity also decreases, but it is the quality which gets compromised far more than quantity, and this again primarily the reason being that there is increasing emphasis on reducing funding, reducing cost, and kind of trying to overcome the problem of fiscal deficit. So during this entire process, equity becomes a great casualty. So by equity here, I mean how the demands and needs of the marginalized sections of society are met, and they are brought at par with the rest of the sections of society. So therefore, inequitous tendencies become far more prominent during the global phase of expansion. And during the economic reform period, that was from 1990s onwards in case of India, a drastic change also came about in attitudes towards education. So many questionable reforms got introduced in due course of time in education sector without even public debates. So this again largely emerged as a top-down approach where large-scale reforms were introduced in the field of education without proper debates being carried out at the ground level. So neither it was the public opinion which mattered, nor the opinion of the NGOs or the unorganized sector. Rather, it was the international agencies which were calling the shots, and the government was being forced to toe the line of action as had been dictated by them. As a result of the above tendencies and phenomena, that is the top-down approach, there were significant changes that were brought about in education system. Now, discussing various trends in the development of education, one can talk about the changes if we compare simultaneously as to what was prior to 1980s, 1990s, and what happened after 1990s, so that a comparative perspective emerges, and everyone can then decide for themselves as to the kind of changes that have come about as a result of globalization. So while the conventional system, that is post-independence India till almost 1990s, the approach that was being adopted was the one that can be described as the welfarist approach. But now this welfarist approach has gradually given way to market approach. So therefore, education is no longer considered as part of the welfare activities or welfare sector, but rather as a market driven and as a profit oriented process. Then there was lot of emphasis on public higher education in the earlier system. So therefore, it was the government funded education system which was important, which now gradually has given way to mixed and private higher educational institutions. So as you can all see this tendency in the mushrooming private aided and unaided institutions, and a large number of engineering and medical colleges that have been mushrooming for past so many decades can largely be explained as a part of this trend of mixed and private higher educational institutions. Then a third difference that has come about is in the realm of public financing. So public financing has gradually started withering, and this has been replaced more by private financing, whereby big business houses and even erstwhile sweet shops are gradually mushrooming as universities and other educational centers. So therefore, this trend also is not seeing any kind of break, rather it is going on and on. Then another difference that can be experienced is that while in the earlier system it was more an emphasis on state financed institutions, though private sector was always there, but it was more an emphasis on state financing of institutions, which again the present trend has replaced by private institutions requiring no government kind of funding and no public funding. So therefore, the private institutions have emerged as self-financing institutions. So this whole concept of self-financing institutions also raises lot of questions on the issue of equity. Then another important change that has come about, while earlier there was lot of emphasis on government recognized institutions, and even the private institutions had to be government recognized in order to attain certain viability and authority as well as support, whereas now the private institutions require no more government recognition, and as a result at times there are many institutions which keep on mushrooming even as they follow illegal norms, and then suddenly the students realize at the end of their education course after probably 3 or 4 or 5 years that the institution in which they were enrolled and where they had spent so much time and money has no value at all in the job market. So this again is a trend that has taken off post 1990s and post globalization. Then another change that one can talk about is that while the earlier trend was more about degree awarding institutions, there was lot of emphasis on the value of the degree that a particular institution was awarding, but now the degree is gradually being replaced by diploma or certificate courses. So as a result, a large number of institutions have emerged which can be described as diploma or degree awarding institutions. So there are a large number of non-degree private institutions and colleges which are mushrooming without any check on their quality as well as quantity. Then another difference that one can talk about regarding conventional vis-a-vis the modern system of education is that how in the realm of private institutions, philanthropy and educational considerations have considerably got compromised. So while earlier philanthropy was a major force that was working behind various private institutions, now instead of philanthropy it is profit, it is market principle that is working, and the commercial motives are far more important than philanthropic principles, and profit motives are definitely at the top. Then another change that one can talk about is that while earlier educational institutions hardly levied any fees, so either the fees was nominal or it was some of the institutions were not charging at all, and education was within the affordability of a larger section of society. But with the emerging trend towards privatization and more private institutions being established in name of making having an impact on the field of higher education, and also to deal with the problem of scarcity of seats. The problem now is that the affordability factor has become a spoil sport. So therefore, the marginalized sections of society, the poor people, are definitely not able to afford, even if the so-called quality institutions are keeping their doors open to all, irrespective of caste, color and creed. So the high levels of fees can and they have been, a detrimental factor behind more and more Indians accessing higher education in past years. Then another important change had been that while earlier the low levels of fees were definitely a reality, now instead of the low level of fees and the high level of fees, another problem is accessibility, because most of these new institutions are not really establishing themselves in the remote tribal areas or rural areas. So there is some kind of a ghettoization in the already existing urban centers of learning. So therefore, a large section of tribals and the rural hinterland is largely remaining aloof from these newly emerging educational centers. And the introduction of the student loan program that has taken off in a big way post 1980s, 1990s, again has not really benefited the poorer sections of society as well as the girl child, because it is invariably the male students belonging to the upper sections of society, upper caste and class network, who are able to make use of these facilities, because parents always find it preferable to spend on the education of the male child if it is going to happen through loan. Rarely a loan is taken for education of the girl child, because another major expenditure that parents are expecting after her education is marriage. So they might as well reserve some fund for her marriage rather than spend it on her education. Then another problem is that the issue of security and mortgage, that has become a major challenge, because loans have become norms of the day. So both mortgages and security issues are definitely impacting the education sector also, just the way they are impacting the housing sector. Then another problem is the issue of high default rates, that is slowly not only seen through the large number of rising cases of suicides, but also with the kind of feeling of emptiness and depression that has set in among the young generation, because of this problem of spending a lot on their education and not getting adequate returns on the other hand. So therefore, the commercial considerations of the various educational institutions are having very negative impact on the larger population. Then another change that can be experienced is while the earlier system was kind of more scholarly and more academically oriented kind of an education system, but the present system, which is the self-financing or commercially viable system, is largely focused upon more profitable subjects of study. So therefore, the whole idea of social sciences, studying social sciences and studying academic disciplines, has gradually given way to studying more commercially viable subjects like science and STEM subjects, as compared to social science subjects, literature, or for that matter history or sociology, etc. So the very importance and existence of these subjects is gradually being replaced, and in fact both the Yashpal Committee and National Knowledge Commission reports also highlighted, the value and importance of STEM subjects as compared to the social sciences, and also too much emphasis and insistence on English language has further created a wide rift between the haves and the have-nots. By haves here I mean those who have the knack of speaking in English and who are well versed in the language, and have-nots those who have not sufficiently been able to hone their skills in the subject. Then another problem has been the role of the heads of the institutions. Earlier was more kind of an academic leadership, where it was not only the managerial skills that were required or the administrative capacities of the heads were not as important as their academic skills, whereas now the roles of the heads of the academic institutions require more of an expertise in financial as well as money management as well as resource generation, because most of these institutions are working in the mode of self-financing. So therefore the importance of academics on as a whole is getting diluted, whether you talk about the subjects that are being taught, or you talk about the kind of students that are coming in, or you talk about the kind of leadership that is emerging in these academic institutions. Now, having discussed the differences that have existed in the pre and post 1990s educational institutions, now let us discuss the issue of reform. So to meet the new challenges of the century, it has been very necessary to reform not only educational institutions but also planning, management, as well as the whole teaching and learning process. And this had to be done not only at the level of the higher educational institutions, but it had to be done right from the grassroots level, that is from pre-primary and primary educational sectors onwards. So therefore, infrastructure development to globalize became a major challenge to reckon with after 1990s, and the whole issue of basic education was raised from time to time. So unless and it was realized by the policy makers that unless and until the anomalies, the shortcomings in the basic education, in the primary sector of education were not dealt with sternly, the human capital formation would not take place. So with this realization, post 1990s, many policies were laid down to improvise this sector of education. So therefore, there were significant breaks and shifts in policy and planning of primary education post 1990s, and this was specifically reflected in the primary sector of education. Now, one also has to talk about various radical shifts that have taken place and how these radical alternatives that have emerged after 1990s have focused on various sectors of education, putting emphasis differently from time to time. But one common theme that emerged during this entire course of reform was the insistence on decentralization. So the decentralized planning and management became the core strategy, and this also became a part of social mobilization. So by decentralized planning, what I need to say is that how the village education community and the block level communities were kind of mobilized, and in this regard one can talk about the constituent amendment in 1993, whereby local bodies in states were given lot of powers. So the whole idea of decentralized management, that is district level, was set up by the CABE, that is Central Advisory Board of Education, which was recommended by the PRIs, that is Panchayati Raj institutions, which were the local self-government bodies which were empowered greatly after 1990s through the constituent amendment bills that were passed from 1993 onwards. As a result, decentralization was introduced in planning and management related to education. So, decentralization in educational planning and management became a core strategy whereby the planners were going to kind of reform the primary system of education, and they were going to meet the challenges by involving the local community. So instead of the top down approach, what it was realized was that probably what was needed was resource generation at the lower level, and in order to ensure success of the program, it was considered imperative to involve the local community, the PRIs and the local self-government. So therefore, various modes were devised for mobilizing people and for involving people's participation in education. And both 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment bills in 1993 provided a statutory framework to achieve this. So another important change that came about was a higher allocation of resources, especially during the 7th and the 8th 5-year plans, roughly covering the period from 1988 to 1997. And also these were not completely to be funded by funded internally, rather they were partially funded by the external aid and grants. So an increasing reliance on aids and grants also became a reality, particularly in the field of primary education and then later on even secondary education during this entire period of globalization. A number of steps were undertaken in order to make the program a success. So for example, one was the enhanced role of the CABE committee, that is Central Advisory Board of Education. Then another change was strengthening of the state boards as well as district boards, and also change in the administrative structures and organization of village education committees. So all these changes were being devised in order to bring about sufficient decentralization in the management of education, and also there was lot of emphasis that was being put now on integrated educational planning as well as management at the district level. So it was not only the national or the state level that was important, the district level and the village level had become equally important, and lot of resource generation was also taking place for these sectors. And the legal frame for the Panchayati Raj institutions had already been put in place through a constitutional amendment 73rd for rural areas and 74th constitutional amendment for urban areas. So having discussed all these various changes that came about in the field of education, I will be taking a short break and will resume shortly. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. And friends, you are requested to be with us, as we will be back after a short break and would be discussing more under today's topic. So thank you so very much. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, you know that today we are talking on education under globalization under our series Gender and Education. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. Dr. Shruti Webb is a prolific professor who believes in giving her best. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Webb once again and request her to continue the lecture further. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika, thanks a lot for this wonderful opportunity. So friends, we were discussing decentralization in education during the phase of globalization, particularly from 1990s onwards. So having described the way globalization took off and how decentralization in educational planning, particularly for the basic education, was considered as the most important policy reform, we can talk about a few examples as to the states where this was experimented. For example, in Bihar education, then also UP also followed this decentralization program in its basic education. Then the Lok Jambush project, and then DPEP, District Primary Education Program. Now, it was not as if decentralization had been introduced only after 1990s, because decentralization existed earlier also as part of the colonial, then post-independence, as part of pre-colonial period, colonial period, and then even in post-independence period, where it was considered that only by strengthening Panchayati Raj institutions, the local problems could effectively be controlled and taken care of. So now, while decentralization was already existing, so therefore a valid question arises as to what were the reasons for failure of decentralization in the preceding phases, that is before 1990s, and what new strategies were devised after 1990s in order to make it far more successful. So if we discuss the shortcomings of decentralization in the period prior to 1990s, then we can talk about that how educational decision making had not really percolated down to the grassroots level in India, and sadly the state of affairs continued even after the Britishers had left. Then the major education reforms and challenges were most of time discussed at the center. So there was this top-down approach which kept on continuing even after independence, and the state government acted as passive recipient of funds from the central government and implementer of centrally sponsored projects. So the issue was that while the funds were being released, that was being done by the center for already decided center sponsored schemes and subjects. So therefore the involvement of the grassroots was negligible, and probably this was the reason that at local level most of these schemes were not really taken care of and they were not really well perceived of. So therefore there was a lot of wastage of resources that had taken place over a long period of time. Also, the states were engrossed in day-to-day administration of education, and there was no interest in strategic planning of human development. So this human capital development was one sector that largely remained unattractive, and it largely remained unaccounted for. The system also never mitigated equity. It was not really able to counter inequity, and it was not really able to address poverty also. So therefore inequity and poverty continued unabated despite the constitutional, so many constitutional amendments and so many constitutional privileges that had been granted to the poorer sections of society. The system rather never gave importance to planning and management as such, and particularly most of the tasks were shifted in due course of time to the lower levels without really strengthening the hands of local institutions, and the decentralized planning merely remained in name and not in practice. So therefore, the blocks and Panchayati Raj institutions failed to really deliver. Then capacity building was a major stumbling block, and capacity building, which is the basic prerequisite for decentralization, was lacking in the system. And for this also, one needs to say that the coordination between the state and the central government was a major force to reckon with, and also there was lack of capacity at the decentralized level also. So capacity building continued to remain a major challenge, and this was a major issue that was picked up from post 1990s onwards, where there was a lot of emphasis now on capacity building at the ground level, at the village level, at the block level, at the state level, rather than everything emanating from the center. Then also another reason was the basic transformation in the organizational framework really did not take place, and the genuine empowerment of the people at the grassroots level was missing. So therefore, even though there at the level of institutions there were rights and there were political rights that had been given by constitution, but when you talk about genuine politicization and when you talk about empowering people at the ground level, that had really not sufficiently taken place. So therefore, what was missing all along was participatory planning. So thereby people participating and people becoming stakeholders themselves. This was one missing link in the entire chain of decentralization that had been going on in India from 1882, when Ripon introduced decentralization as a major policy shift. So participatory planning, which had long been conceived as an important step, was taken care of post 1990s, and this was not only about democratic decentralization, but it was also about it was also about devolution of power to people, to common man. And for this, various school management committees, village education committees and panchayat education committees were constituted. And these VECs, etc., were not only to function as far as education was concerned, but also to take care of the overall health, hygiene, safety, security and overall development and growth of the school community. So therefore, with gradual devolution of power post 1990s, it was considered as more viable to bring about decentralization, not only as a rhetoric but also as a reality. So therefore, a lot of importance was attached to the national policy on education from post 1986 onwards, and also a program of action was devised to put into practice all the major reform initiatives. And India's ambitious goal of basic education for all to the age of 14 years meant that a great degree of devolution of power had to take place, and local management of resources became absolutely essential, because only then could the mass education be a reality and not merely a dream. Then therefore, the Constitutional Amendment Acts 73rd and 74th, both became very crucial pieces of legal developments, which were going to be instrumental in bringing these a legality in the overall process of decentralization. So therefore, the changes that came about, one can discuss about the changes in various ways. So for example, there were major shifts that came about now after 1990s. So talking about these shifts, one can discuss that how there was a gradual shift from state ownership to partnership. Then another shift that came about was from collaboration to mobilization. So more and more people to be mobilized at the village level, and not only replication of previous trends, but starting of some new strategies. Then there was increasing emphasis, a shift in the emphasis from input to output criteria. That is, it is not only the enrollment of students that is important. What is far more important is that how many students have successfully completed those years of education till 14 years. So basically, how to tap the dropout rate. So therefore, it was not only the enrollment ratio that was important, or the enrollment rate that was important, but the decreasing dropout rate, because only that would ensure that the number of students which had joined the system were also able to complete the system successfully. And they did not, this did not result in wastage or stagnation of resources. Then another change that came about was a gradual and slow shift from higher education to basic education. So the core strategy of education now gradually lost its stopped considering higher education as being the most important or most the major resource allocator, but for them basic education, primary education became far more a viable field of investment. So therefore, gradually there was a shift away from investing in higher education to basic education and primary education. This again has been a tendency post 1990s, where higher education, higher levels of education are no longer considered as viable or as part of the public sector, and it is considered that rather the private sector should take over this, and the government should be more concerned and more focused about basic education. Then also there was a shift from the kind of learning which earlier was more teacher focused to now the learning being more learner focused or learner centers focused. So this again brought about a significant shift in not only curriculum being reframed, but also involvement of the local community in a number of activities that were considered as part of the overall educational setup of the rural areas. Then also there was, while the traditional system was more top-down approach, where it was a lot of knowledge was being disseminated through the teacher, through the textbooks, now it became more participatory in nature. So post 1980s, 1990s, there was a trend of reducing the impact and influence of teacher as well as textbooks in the entire teaching learning process, and giving far more importance to participatory learning, that is the concept of learning by doing, the famous idea that was introduced by the famous educationist Dewey gradually took over. And so with this kind of participatory teaching, where a lot of knowledge was to be generated by students themselves through their interaction with the local environment, with the local community, became far more prominent after globalization. Then also memorization gradually gave way to learning and to imbibing new skills. So therefore a more practical approach that was to be adopted by these educational institutions. Now another important development that one must talk about is that how education ultimately resulted in human resource development, or it was expected to result in human resource development. So therefore, one major factor that is a very important constituent of any production process is labor. And labor without education and proper training only remains unskilled labor. Whereas global economies are in need of greater and more better equipped skilled labor, educated labor. So therefore, education definitely is a source of human resource development, and therefore there was a lot of emphasis on reducing illiteracy and on encouraging at least basic education, so as to some kind of educated labor could be provided for the mushrooming multinational corporations that were going to be on the scene. Then one can also give examples of various countries who have through their policies and planning initiatives have kind of brought about a shift from labor to human capital formation. For example, the USA experience, one can talk about how the human capital formation became a major thrust area for them, and how various scholars like Schultz and Mark Bloch have discussed at length as to the impact of education on creation of human capital formation, and how through quality higher education, another trend that started was export of knowledge as well as labor. Now, coming to our discussion on the Indian educational system as it happened after 1990s, just in a passing reference, one can talk about as to how the Indian education system was performing before even independence and before even the Britishers came on the scene, that is 1757. So as we all know, the preceding system of education was more about tolls and pathshalas and gurukula system, and it was far away from equity, that is a large number of sections of society, the marginalized groups, were deliberately kept away from these educational institutions. The system that was improvised by the colonial masters was more about setting up educational institutions which were open to all, irrespective of their caste, color, creed or sex. But then here again the issue of inequity continued to persist, because it was definitely Bhadralok and the middle class who were able to make use of these English based educational institutions rather than the poor masses of India. So the Indian education system as it developed after 1834, and the way Macaulay, an English parliamentarian who had prepared the pattern of education for India in 1834 visualized, the schools were started to teach English and various general subjects. And in 1857, in various provinces like Madras, Calcutta, Bombay, universities were started, and the 3 presidency colleges were started by the government, and they were affiliated to the respective universities on the basis of London University. So a very foreign and alien kind of system of education was superimposed on Indian education system, and gradually this again resulted in creating two kind of social groups, the educated and those who could not afford education, or those who did not have access to English educated institutions. So therefore there was a clear-cut divide between these two social groups. A number of types of universities that existed even prior to independence, for example the affiliating universities, then the unitary university, residential university, deemed to be university, and specialized university. and these various categories of universities have continued till date. Now, if we talk about the current paradigm of education and the current status of various educational institutions, then one can say that there have been more than 370 universities, and many of them are public funded, and in the past 50 years a number of colleges and universities has increased, and most of these universities are not even some of them are not recognized, and some of them are aided and unaided. And University Grants Commission, which is the apex body for higher education under the human resource ministry, has continued to play a very important and instrumental role in devising various strategies and planning initiatives, and also initiating various reforms, particularly with reference to higher education. Now, if we talk about the world ranking of universities, and we try to locate what has been the status of Indian universities in this world ranking, then in the first 50 we do not stand anywhere, and even in the first 100 we do not stand anywhere, but yes, in first 200 there were 13 institutions that managed to find their names. Out of them there were 6 IIMs and there were 7 IITs. So therefore, a lot needs to be done to bring our educational institutions to global levels and standards. Now, coming to the issue of quality of higher education, major challenges have been faced in this sphere also, and while a number of remarkable achievements can be ascribed to Western universities, which has resulted in a large scale student migration to countries like America, various European countries, even some Chinese universities in Singapore and Hong Kong, but Indian students on the whole are larger in any university abroad, because they are there in search of quality education. So quality education in Indian universities has suddenly become a major issue. And also various new subjects have been introduced which require new methodology and a new interdisciplinary approach. And there are a number of sources of revenue for advanced countries to experiment in these new subjects and in new disciplines, which sadly is missing in Indian universities. Now, coming to the Indian scenario and how a higher education has taken off during the global period of expansion. So, in this one can talk about the National Knowledge Commission and how it has recommended almost 1500 universities in India. 1500 universities should be there to cater to our teeming population. Then India, which has a sizable percentage of population in the age group of 16 to 25 years, considerably demands both quantity as well as quality education, and the globalized world, which is in need of human resources in the field of science, technology, medicine, etc., is definitely going to benefit a lot if such kind of investment is made in higher education in India. And India has a lot of scope for knowledge export as well. In fact, 150 years of university education, especially in English medium, has the scope for attracting students from other countries also. But here again, the issue is that of quality in higher education, which has continued to be a deterrent for our higher education system attracting more and more students from abroad. So, now discussing what was the role played by GATS in 2005, that is General Agreement on Trade and Services, which India signed in the General Agreement on Trade in Service, which highlighted that there should be no barrier for service in any part of the world. as a result, there was complete opening up of the education sector, and any foreign university can start its branch in India. Any Indian university can open up its center in any country. So, having opened the gates of education through this GATS 2005, major changes have come about in the field of higher education. Now, coming to the issue of recent developments in India and how these various agreements and trading practices that have changed after 1990s have impacted the field of education would be an interesting discussion. So, a number of new colleges and self-financing scheme universities have mushroomed in all parts of the country. As a result, autonomous status has also been given to some colleges, universities, and many colleges have also acquired degree conferring status. So, they can even confer the degrees on, which earlier was only the mainstay of a university. Only a university could confer a degree, but now even colleges can do that. Then accreditation by professional bodies like NAC has become mandatory, which again has been done in order to bring about the aspect of quality and accountability, because accountability is definitely linked to accreditation, and therefore it is no longer considered as only establishment of an institution as an important milestone, but also how to monitor the functioning of that institution and to ensure that it meets certain quality standards. Then supervision and control by professional bodies like MCI or AICTE on regular basis has also become mandatory. Then also the emphasis is more on job oriented courses to bring about greater employability, and also the influence of add-on courses like certificate courses, diploma courses has gradually been on the rise. So, therefore, with these major guiding principles, there has definitely been a change in the way governments are now spending money on education, and with this perspective, we shall briefly be discussing the kind of expenditure that was earmarked in the past budgets. So, having discussed these various points and also trying to bring about linkages between them, I shall now take a break, and will in the next lecture I will be resuming the discussion from here. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, we will be meeting very soon and would be discussing more. But if you wish to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. With this note, thank you. Thank you once again. Thank you so much, ma'am.